remember, Abraham comes around in a time where there were no religious institutions altogether. There were institutions, there have always been institutions. As soon as they're human beings, they have institutions, bureaucracies. Abraham was born in a time what they call a pagan world. His father was actually an idol manufacturer. Not idol as I-D-L-E, but idol, I-D-O-L. He's a manufacturer. He made a lot of money selling gods to people. Basically, it was like the modern day psychic, if you wish, which you find in many storefronts, Manhattan and other places. So people would come to him and he would have an idol for whatever your needs were. I know it sounds a little funny, but that's how it was. And Abraham, being who he was, as a child, realized there's something wrong with this whole thing. He sensed, as all seekers sense, that there's something more to reality and to life than what's the obvious. Realize that the material world is just a surface. And this is the truth as any seeker, any thinker, whether from a spiritual perspective or from a scientific perspective, that's the essence of all wisdom, is to realize that the surface is just the surface. There's something that makes this thing tick. So whether it's an expert in economic trends, if there's such a thing, or an expert in recognizing patterns, or an expert in medicine or science, you have people who look at something where the naked eye or the untrained eye of the layperson will just see external forces, and a trained person will see a pattern, will see a trend, will see a law. Essentially, if you want to sum up science, is understanding the underlying unifying laws that explain the multitude of phenomena. And Abraham was exactly such a man. He was growing up in a home and was looking for, what is this all about? Why are we here? All the big questions that we ask. And he had a father, his name was Terach, who clearly was selling meaning to people. But he was selling it in the form of idols. What were idols? Idols were symbols of some type of either divinity, transcendence, and so on. They were made out of stones, out of wood. We're not going to submit and suggest that necessarily some type of stupid, primitive act, because idol worship was actually very sophisticated. We have it today too. Many things we buy, we may not call them idols, but we worship them. You have, for example, sports worship. You have people who worship money. You have people who worship many things. Maybe we don't like to use the word worship. It sounds too religious. But the word fan, F-A-N, is short for fanatic. But you don't never hear anyone say a sports fanatic and a religious fan. But that's the same word. It means some type of obsessive commitment to something that not necessarily have real value. So human beings in all of history always needed to have crutches, always search for things, and sometimes what they got in return was something completely unreal, but it satisfied them. How many panaceas, how many false idols do we worship in our lives? What we think is valuable. Then one day you wake up, you have a reality check that what you thought was so important is really meaningless. So in those times, the time wasn't different, and Abraham was searching for something more real. Some call it the search for God. Whatever word you want to use for it, but it's a search that it's something that was not man-made. Something that was not just a fabrication or some type of man-made institution, men controlling other men. So he went out to search. Through process of elimination, he realized it can't be something that is constructed by human beings. And through his own search, he began to find answers. But he didn't find his ultimate answer until he came to the ultimate reality, realization, the ultimate epiphany. And that epiphany was that his search itself was based on a false premise. Because he realized that if I and every human being on this earth is only part of a larger reality, how can the part dictate the whole? He realized that itself is a subtle form of arrogance. It's I am defining and trying to understand the whole, when I'm really a part of a whole. If that's true, I have to shut down and let the whole emerge within me. It's like the example I've given in the past when people ask the question about death. No one should know of that. Where does the soul go to upon death? Question people ask. Where does that life go to? The life I knew, the life I loved, now is just a inanimate, a dead corpse. I don't mean to sound morbid, but it's the question that many of us ask. Here, the same person was alive, now all that's left is a shell. I witnessed this myself personally when my father passed away. So one moment like that, one moment that. It's a mystery. So we ask the question, where did that life go? Did it go anywhere? But if you think about it, the question itself is based on an arrogant premise. What is the premise? The premise is, I am where it's at. So I wonder where the soul went. Who said you are where it's at? How do you know that you are the center of existence? So let's create an imaginary dialogue between a refrigerator and electricity. So the refrigerator asks the electricity, where do you go when they pull the plug? So of course the electricity responds to the refrigerator, if it's going to respond and give it the dignity of a response. What chutzpah, what nerve do you have? You're a little box that they invented the last 100, 200 years ago to refrigerate food. You're generating my electricity, confining it in the box for a short while, and now you think you're the center of the universe, and you ask me where I go. I was here long before you ever existed, long before anyone even conceived of you. I just go back to my natural habitat, which is not confined in time and space as you know it. All you know is your little box. And when you think about it, it's exactly true, of course. By asking the question where the soul goes is assuming that our perception of reality is 100%, and where does the soul go? Maybe we have a very small percentage. Maybe we only see the tip of the iceberg. It would be like the tip of the iceberg asking, where do I come from? You know, you come from a big mountain of ice that nobody can see. It's under the water. Someone asks, what makes the world tick today? Nobody will say it's apparent to the naked eye, to our five senses. You can't experience what makes the world tick with your senses. We know that what we see with our senses are the outer layer, outer surface. And maybe outer, I don't know how many levels of outer. Of forces under the surface that shape us. If it's in the human being, it's DNA, cells, subcells. If you talk on a physics level, it's not just elements made of molecules, made of atoms, it's subatomic particles, subatomic particles. If you talk about intelligence, it's not just the conscious, it's the unconscious, the unconscious, and who knows how many layers are there beneath the surface when you go down the rabbit hole, as they say. So today, any wise person knows we know a lot, but we also know that what we know is just a very small part of the picture. What do we know about this brain of ours that's in this head? A brain that's about the size of a palm of the hand. How many ideas can this brain contain? We know a hard drive contains a certain amount, then it runs out of memory. What about our brain? And what about all the mysteries of the brain? We're just beginning to get a little glimpse of it all. So the point is not to suggest that we don't know anything. That's not what I'm trying to. We know a lot. Look what we've done with our knowledge. But how much more knowledge? So what do we know about the whole? We know about the piece. And that's what Abraham realized. That the secret to finding truth is to stop taking yourself so seriously. And you have to let go and let truth emerge. The secret to any type of resonating experience, I mentioned music before, is not trying to grab the music and force it inside you. It's shut down. Let it penetrate. Let it enter you. Absorb it. And then it emerges. Something emerges. You're touched by something. Love. Can you go and buy love? Is it a commodity that you can get off a shelf? Or maybe we have to do something to make ourselves more receptive and free ourselves of some things, and then things emerge. As I've discussed many times, all things real are not acquirable. And they all emerge. They all require a process. They don't just, you can't just grab it. You can't take a seed, and no matter what you do with it, jam it or bang it or shoot it with laser energy, it's going to grow into a tree. No. The seed got to go into the ground. You have to nurture it, care for it. It needs water. And slowly, it will emerge. Abraham came to that discovery. Now, in this week's chapter, there are many different parts of the narrative. I'm not going to go through them all. I want to just take this a step further. There's discussion about a battle that Abraham fights with the different kings. But at the end of the chapter, close to the end, where before God makes his covenant with Abraham, you have the story that one of the kings that he battled with, and Abraham had conquered hostages and so on. So this king comes to him and says to him these words: "Ten li hanefesh, give me the souls, and you can keep the property." This is after he wanted to make a truce. Let's end the war. Give me the souls that you've conquered, and you can keep the property. This word "ten li hanefesh" is a very powerful expression, because as we'll soon see, it's really the battle over the soul. That there are two forces that battle over our souls. Who's going to own your soul? And this is a key component in learning how to dare, learning how to develop courage, which is learning who's going to win your soul, because it's the soul that is the key thing. And that's why this king makes the focus. He says, the property I don't care about. I don't care about everything. Just give me the soul. Who controls the soul is the one who controls the destiny. Think of it of our children. Who controls the soul of our children? They're born with pure, innocent souls, pure, innocent minds and hearts. Everything is a clean slate. Who will control this entity called the pure soul of a newborn child? And we were all once this newborn child. And if you identify that as the battle zone, battleground, that's where courage is built or courage is destroyed. That's where fear is born, or that's where strength is born. So we'll discuss that in a few moments in a little more detail. And then you find right after that, in the verses, what I just read to you was, what verse was that? Here we go. Ten li hanefesh is chapter, just if you want to look it up, in your home, or wherever you want to look at it, it's chapter 14, verse 21. Am I right? 14:21. Let me make sure. Yeah, 14:21. Then when you read a few verses further, he goes on and says in chapter 15 now, and that after these words, God speaks to Abraham in a vision. And he says to him, Al tira Avram, don't be afraid, Abraham. I am your shield to protect you from any of your challenges. That's what it says. And your reward will be great. It's a cryptic verse. So I want to discuss this verse in context of the Abraham's journey. Now, to really understand it properly in context, the beginning of this chapter, Lech Lecha, is immediately jumps at us with a question. If you read it closely, you discover that Abraham was 75 years old when this chapter begins. So we really know very little about Abraham for the first 75 years of his life. His birth is documented in the last chapter, and just his family, but that's it. The story begins with Lech Lecha. What's Lech Lecha? Abraham lived in Ur Kasdim, which was a city in what is modern day southeastern Iraq, of all places. Not far from where the center of most of the Middle East trouble is happening. Right there, southeastern Iraq, near the Gulf, near the Persian Gulf. There's a lot of oil there, then and now too. And the first commandment to Abraham, the Jew, is at age 75 is Lech Lecha, leave your homeland. Lech Lecha ma'atzecha, your land. Malatzecha, the place of your birth, and Beis Avicha, the home of your parents, and go to the land that I will show you. And Abraham travels northwest. He travels along the Euphrates, which, as we know, goes right through Iraq. And then when you go west from the Euphrates, you go through Jordan or Syria to the land of Canaan, as it was called then, which we call the land of Israel. And but this begins a journey. As we all know, it's probably the single biggest journey in all of history. This would be the birth of Judaism. Later would give birth to Christianity and Islam. Until this day, this is the hotbed of earth. The biggest battles were all fought over the city called Jerusalem, over the land of Israel. There's no place on earth where more battles have been fought. Through religions, through nations. Everybody feels that you have to control Israel if you want to control the world. Why that is not the scope of our discussion. I've given classes on this topic. But clearly that part of geography is not a small factor, and it affects us till this day. For many of us, it's a mystery. What are they fighting about? What are they fighting? What do they want? What does everybody want? Whether Jews or the Muslims or the Christians or the Crusaders, throughout history, the Ottoman Empire, this little piece of land. And it all begins with Abraham, who traveled there and settled there. He will buy the Ma'arat HaMachpelah, which we'll read in 2 weeks, which is in Hebron, the grave site, which is the burial ground of where Abraham and Sarah would end up. He bought it for his wife Sarah. Abraham would be buried there, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob and Leah, Adam and Eve. Hebron till this day. There's complete battles going on there. Travel there and you'll see what's going on thousands of years later. So clearly this Abraham was both a great pioneer, but also some would call maybe the beginning of all trouble. But maybe it's interdependent. Great pioneers cause trouble. I mean good trouble in this case. So you see just from observation and historical study that there's something about Abraham and his journey, this Lech Lecha, this chapter, that changed the universe. Now, of course, it changed the universe in the most obvious way, that Abraham was the first to embrace a policy of justice, social justice. He is the father of social justice. His commitment in this chapter is to teach his children and his family and to generations to come that even though we naturally can be selfish and narcissistic and take care of ourselves, our dedication has to be of justice and charity. He opened his home, his tent, and with this was born a concept that was unknown until that point. Even today, it's not natural for many of us, but it's become the norm. It's become a standard. Everyone knows, even those that may not be so giving, know giving is considered to be a virtue. Abraham is the father of all of this. So you can imagine that this man has a lot of secrets. And he was not, being a pioneer, he had no one to turn to. Who inspired him? It wasn't his father or his mother. He actually defied everybody and he challenged them. Because when he began to explore, he wasn't quiet about it. He spoke about it. And he had many, many students. And he defied the leaders of the time that were completely about power. If you think the monarchs in the Middle Ages were tyrants and despots and total monopolies over control, you can imagine in those days what it was like. And Abraham challenged it. Abraham said, no, doesn't matter whether Nimrod, who was the king then, who was like the superpower of the whole world, which was essentially the Mesopotamian valley. That's where civilization, the cradle of civilization. And he challenged the authority. He says, every human being is entitled to rights. It's pretty forward-thinking for a person 3,800 years ago. It didn't become institutionalized till 200 years ago, 300 years ago, the idea that all people are created equal and social justice. It was an ideal written about by some philosophers, some aspired to it, but institutionalized just 300 years ago. So that's pretty amazing. There was a man that stood up for that, and he didn't just stand up. This is what he taught his children, and his children would teach it to their grandchildren. And he ruffled many feathers, rocked the boat. So he clearly had a lot of courage and strength. So this journey begins Lech Lecha. And if you think about it, it's really a journey that we all go on. Perhaps not in such dramatic terms, but we all go on this journey where we come of age. And the question is, are you going to make your mark? Or are you going to become a conformist? Or are you just going to follow the patterns and routines that were passed on to you and never rock the boat? I'm not just talking about going against cultural norms, but against your own fears and your own limitations. So what is it that Abraham discovered that helped him do that? And how can we discover the same thing within ourselves? So I've discussed at length many times the meaning of Lech Lecha. And briefly, the first step, the key to it all, and Abraham, age 75, was able to reach that, but we can reach it far earlier because he paved the way already for us. So he broke the ground, is that in an odd way, when the Torah says God tells Abraham, go, he describes in detail his point of departure. Leave your land, the place of your birth, and the home of your parents. But when it comes to the destination, God is very vague. Go to the land that I will show you. When you give someone directions, usually it's the other way around. Like when you have a GPS, you have to punch in the details of your destination, not of your location. You know where you are, or the GPS finds where you are. The location is the key. The destination is the key. And here is the other way around. God, the destination is vague. The land I will show you. East, west, south, north. Where is it? What's the address? What country? What city? What mountain? What valley? Signposts. When it comes to the departure, God says, your land, your place of your birth, home of your parents. So I've explained this many times, that this refers to really the secret of all movement. And that is that you have to free yourself of your subjectivity. Many people will say, like Stephen Covey's 7 Habits, that they have to have your eye on the destination. That's true to some extent, but there's something that's neglected. The destination is not as important as to get away from where you are. Because you can have a very focused, clear picture of where you want to reach. But what happens without the invisible forces that are keeping you trapped to where you are? So you may even see the destination. You may have it very clear, but then you embark on your journey, and you have a ball and chain weighing you down of your past, your baggage of your past that doesn't let you travel. That's the problem. So one half of it is the knowing the destination, but even an important part, more important part is what part of your past doesn't let you move. And in one word, it's subjectivity. It's your own subjective forces that keep you trapped. And what God is telling Abraham, and He's telling each of us, every journey begins by leaving, or at least identifying and recognizing the 3 forces of subjectivity that keep you trapped. And what are they? Number 1, inherent self-love. The blind spots and the biases of self-love, we minimize when it comes to ourselves. We don't see things clearly. They're blurred. They're underestimated usually. Sometimes our strengths are overestimated. Sometimes the other way around. Sometimes we think much worse of ourselves than we really should be. It's exaggerated. It's amplified. It's distorted. That's how it is. It's human nature. Which is why we go to advisors, consultants that are objective. Because we can't really see, especially when it comes to something that's emotional. The second subjectivity is our parental influences. Beis Avicha, the home of our parents. As I mentioned earlier, and quite obvious, in our formative years, our parents shape us, for good or for bad. And we pick up things. And finally, the third thing that traps us is social, cultural programming. Social pressure, peer pressure. We don't want to stand out. You don't want to come. You want to look. Maybe you want to look a little cool, a little different, but within the framework of what people consider acceptable. To stand out is a very difficult thing for us. Even though we all like to think we're originals and we're trailblazers, but it's not that simple. It comes to really doing something that stand up for your conscience when everybody's going the other direction takes a lot of courage. And it's all normal. These 3 forces are all natural forces. They don't make us evil. They create problems when you consider this to be all fine and good. But they trap you. And those 3 forces are the key thing that God tells Abraham. You want to find yourself? The land that I will show you means not just the land, I will show you the land. I will show you who you are. You need to some way free yourself from these forces. Which is why, think about your own life. First times you really start understanding yourself or identifying some of your strengths is usually when you leave home. First time you go to summer camp, to dorm, to travel, whenever those years are. It shouldn't be too early, because the earlier on a person's life, just like a bird in a nest, it's important to be in your nest, in your hearth, nurtured. But a bird that's nurtured properly will have the strength and courage to fly when it has to fly. And when it goes to fly the first time, that's when you really see what your strengths are like. Because now your father and mother are not there haunting you. I don't mean haunting necessarily in a negative way. Their presence is not defining you. Now you have to make a decision. And initially it can be somewhat overwhelming, somewhat difficult. And in general, most of the talents and skills that we discover are usually not when we're in the presence of those that have shaped us. It's when you have to be on your own and suddenly there's no one else to do it. Hey, why don't you do it? I don't know how to do it. And then you do it, and you realize, hey, I'm not bad at it. Many things happen through this type of experimentation that happens outside of the nest, so to speak. So even in the healthiest family, it's a beautiful, healthy family. I'm not talking about a dysfunctional, a very functional one. It also comes a time where the umbilical cord needs to be cut, metaphorically speaking. And this happens many times in our lives. Whether it's the first time we go to school, when we're 3, 4 years old, or whatever age today, 2 years old, or the first time we leave home, or when we get married and we build our own homes, or when we travel and we come to a new place. But obviously, we have, as I said, our fears and our routines that stop us from the Lech Lecha in our lives. But that's a critical component. I'm not suggesting here with this evening everybody can suddenly go on the Lech Lecha journey, but I am suggesting that you can begin to identify, is this true? What baggage is holding you back? And being honest and having the courage to acknowledge that you may not be as courageous as you think you are, that you may be more trapped than you think you are, is the beginning of your redemption. I know you think the beginning is to just begin traveling. No, the beginning is to identify what is it that weighs me down. What of these 3 factors? Now, all these 3 factors affect us all the time, but different ones affect us more than others. Understanding it is a critical component to freeing yourself of it. And that's what Abraham begins with, the Lech Lecha. And then we go to the verses I was reading. That what is the battle? The battle is over our souls, over our psyches. Because to put it bluntly, especially as stated in Hasidic thought, Kabbalistic thought, your soul is a wild, free spirit. I mean in a good way wild. Unfettered. Left to its own, it's completely fearless. You have inside of you a soul that is alive, like a fire that is uncontained. Of course, a fire that's uncontained can also cause damage, but it also has that fearlessness. The same words that God says to Abraham, do not fear, similar words were said to a young boy a little more than 300 years ago. His name was Yisrael Baal Shem Tov. Became the father of the Hasidic movement, the founder of the Hasidic movement. Yisrael Baal Shem Tov's father passed away, died when he was very young. He was just a few years old. On his father's deathbed, his father said to him 2 things. He said to him, remember, fear nothing but God. And the second thing, love everyone unconditionally. Now you can imagine, it's nice lines, we read them many times, but when you hear them when you're young, at 3 years old, from a father whose last words from his mouth, makes a deep impression. We should all have our parents for many healthy years. But imagine if our parents told this to us every day. These 2 statements. And not just told it, lived it, examples. These things have deep impact. It's far harder to tell this to someone who's already a terrified adult and say, hey, I forgot to mention to you that you shouldn't fear anything. Yeah, but now I've developed deep fears. I've told the story, I think, of my uncle, Olav Shalom. His name is Yosef Itzchak, my mother's brother. When he was a little boy, my grandmother told me the story. It's my maternal grandmother. That one night there was a thunderstorm. And he was scared, child wakes up in the middle of a thunderstorm. It was a very loud thunderstorm. He comes running to his mother's bed, my grandmother. She calms him down. What are you afraid of? He says, the thunder. So she tells him, you don't have to fear anything except God. He goes back to sleep, somewhat soothed, quieted, calmed. Well, the thunderstorms go. There's another thunderstorm a little while later. The thunder started rumbling again. And again he gets terrified. He comes running to his mother's bed. Now what? He says, I told you. He says, I'm afraid of God. That's what he answers. By him now, instead of saying thunder, he said God. So, what would the father of the Baal Shem Tov mean when he told this to his son, and what does God mean here? Well, we really need to identify what God means. That's the real key thing here. As I've discussed many, many times, countless times, the word God is a very deceptive word, which really means nothing, frankly, because what does God mean? For many of us, God is some guy with a long white beard in heaven that's sitting on a throne waiting to strike us with lightning when we misbehave. So, a more sophisticated definition of God Actually, I've documented, if any of you have seen Toward a Meaningful Life, my book, you can read the chapter on God. I spelled it out there specifically from the sources. God is far more complicated than that, obviously. It's not a nursery school, childish version of God. As a matter of fact, many of the fears that are associated with religion, fear, dogma, intimidation, anger, guilt, are associated with a false God, with a God that I would say is not a real God. As one of the great Rebbes once said to a self-proclaimed atheist, the God you don't believe in, I also don't believe in. So, that type of God is this type of like big principle in the sky, like a school principal, angry, catches us when we make a mistake, we've sinned, and now you're going to be punished. This is the typical knee-jerk reaction most of us have to a biblical God, which is why so many people reject it. And for good reason. What is this? God is just a big, angry father, grandfather, uncle, principal, like the angriest guy we can remember from our childhood that terrorized little children type of thing. They call it an ogre. However, when you understand God as Abraham came to discover God, that God is not some type of man-made fantasy, a man-made fear machine. God is the essence of all reality. And actually, we can't really define God, because any definition we give would be a human definition. So then how do we relate to this? We relate to it through process of elimination. We know God is nothing that man can create. It has to be something that is beyond us, that creates us, not we create it. And I'm not getting down to the word creation. The point being, as I said, the whole dictates the part, not the part the whole. And Abraham discovered this by, as I said, through seeking. And he realized, get my ego out of the way, get my subjective elements out of the way, and this reality, this deeper reality emerges. Just like when you shut down your senses, your eyes, your ears, or as I mentioned before, the thinking of the refrigerator, that I'm it, certain truths emerge. That's called resonance. You want to hear the melody and music within yourself, the melody and music within another person, you have to get yourself out of the way. If you're busy in a rush hour, if your mind is cluttered with all kinds of things, you're not going to be able to hear someone that loves you or you love speak to you. You have other things going on that are distracting you. Turbulence is called. If you want to hear the soul, your soul speak, you want to hear the soul of your child speak, if you want to hear the soul of anyone you love, you have to shut down all these noises. Now, noises don't just mean physical noises, it means all our preoccupations. That's the process of finding truth, is the shutting down. That's the process, lech lecha, the leaving behind, the shedding of old layers, and new layers can emerge. It's the secret to all growth. Because as long as the future is a product of the past, then it's not the future. Someone will say, I want it on my terms. Okay, you'll have what your terms are, and that's where it stays. It's like they say, it's an expression I've coined, I don't know where it comes from, it's a combination of many places. If you think what you thought, and you speak what you spoke, and you do what you did, what are you going to have? It's simple mathematics. What you had. But what do they say is a sign of insanity? Doing the same thing again and again and expecting different results. Or in the healing world they say, if nothing changes, nothing changes. But we want better results by doing the same thing you did before. How exactly is that supposed to work? It doesn't work that way. You want a different result, you better do something differently. But that requires work. And that requires challenging yourself. And that requires looking whether you made mistakes. And that's far more uncomfortable. So you can throw the ball the same way every time, it's going to bounce back the same way. You have to throw it a different way, or maybe throw a different ball, or maybe not throw a ball altogether, maybe try something new. That's lech lecha. It's getting yourself out of the way. I know it sounds odd. You say, what do you mean? I'm trying to solve my problem. How can I solve the problem if I'm not there? The you that you think is there is what you're getting out of the way, and maybe another you will emerge that you're not aware of. That's the whole secret of all growth. Someone shares with you an idea, and it contradicts an idea that you're very firmly convinced of. An intelligent person doesn't just say, hey, I'm just not going to let any new ideas, I have it all figured out. intelligent person will hear it, review it, and challenge themselves. Now, I don't mean we have to do this every second. Obviously, we've made decisions based on certain research. But especially when it comes to personal matters, if you're not ready to challenge yourself, forget about it. Where are you going to exactly find solutions? You want everything else to change around you except you. That's both childish and obviously subjective. Abraham realized that to find God, it takes a real price. You have to be able to surrender your ego and not obliterate or annihilate yourself. It's an act of strength. Restraint, when it comes to allowing your spiritual voice to emerge, takes a lot more strength than the arrogant voice that does not let those voices emerge. Love is a celebration of vulnerability, as I discussed last week, which for many sounds very odd. What do you mean? I don't like to be vulnerable. Why am I celebrating it? But when you're strong enough to celebrate your vulnerability, you're strong enough to find out who you really are. Yes, it's true we live in a cruel world. We live in a world where there are predators, there are forces, there are people who can exploit and take advantage. So I'm not suggesting something letting your guard down, but at the same time, you have to also always have in the second half of your consciousness and psyche that maybe there's an opportunity that I'm going to meet somebody new. Not to judge everybody, that everybody is for sure cruel and exploitive, just because everybody I've met till now. That's also part of opening yourself up to new realities. Obviously, it has to be done with care. But to close yourself off and says, because I've been hurt so many times, I'm not going to let myself be hurt again, is obviously undermining yourself. So when the Baal Shem Tov heard from his father, don't fear anything but God, he wasn't saying tremble before God, don't tremble before man. He was saying no. Anything man-made is superficial. Anything man-made is as strong as you are. Why would you be afraid of something that's like you? Everything man-made is mortal, temporary, impermanent. Why are you afraid of impermanent things? You want to have something to stand in awe of. Stand in awe of the permanence of reality, of something that's eternal, something that isn't man-made. And you know what that is? Inside of you, it's your soul. The soul is the God within us. It is the flame, as I said, Ner Hashem Nishma Sodom, the flame of God. It is an eternal flame, and left on its own is fearless. But it's trapped in a fearful body. It's trapped in a terrified and frightened world. Because you see, materialism by definition is a frightened place. Why? Because anyone who knows, think of it like in a poker game, or any type of negotiation. If you know your hand is weak, you may be able to fake it because we live in a world that there's a lot of fakery going on. But ultimately, you know that it's weak. Materialism, by definition, cannot have confidence. How could it have confidence? Everything that's in the material world dies. How could something that dies really be confident? How confident can we be? Some of the Buddhist schools of thought say that all fears come down to the fear of death. Because everyone subconsciously or unconsciously knows that they will one day not be here. And that insignificance, that type of finality, affects everything we do in our lives. The entire philosophy is based on this. That's why we're ambitious, that's why we try to make a mark, that's why we become more arrogant, that's why we step on others. It's all to find some way to make sure that we are perpetuated. Because materialism by definition is weak, is a weak hand. It's mortal. It erodes, it ages, it dies. As the Rabbeinu Bachai says it's a sad statement, but also a very true statement. When do we begin to age? So no one wants to know, right? Well, you begin to age as soon as you're born. Because if you're not 1 year old, 2 years old, you're never going to become 50 years old and 80 years old and 90. So as soon as a child is born, it's already beginning to age. It's just that it's not obvious then. The child is still on the up. But if you think about it, it's just a matter of time. So if you put all your confidence in material success, in material prosperity, how confident can a person really be? How secure can you be if you've built your whole structure on an insecure foundation? Or a foundation that everyone knows cannot last? So what's the alternative? The alternative is, this is what God says to Abraham. Now that you've discovered a higher reality, and that it's a part of you that by shedding, by what's the word I want to use? Yes, shedding the layers of your ego, shedding the layers of your consciousness, and connecting to me, meaning to a higher reality, will cause you to fear nothing. And that's exactly what happened to the Baal Shem Tov. He lived a life that was fearless, basically a life of the soul instead of a life of the body. So what really keeps us trapped? Yes, it's our subjectivity, but our subjectivity is the domain of our conscious awareness of our lives. When you, for example, find out, let's say you're at work, and some emergency, God forbid, happens. Let's say a good emergency. Suddenly, if it's really important to you, you're really not going to care about what anybody else thinks around you. You think when mothers saw their children being ripped away from them, when they were being carted like animals into the concentration camps, you think those mothers and fathers cared about what they're going to look like tomorrow, and what makeup they have on, and what clothing they're wearing. Because when it comes to matters that are real survival, suddenly you realize what really matters. Now, no one should ever have to come to a point of such a low point, but it just shows you that we live superficial lives. And the more a person relates to their soul and lives a soulful life, the less fear they develop. It's a simple formula. The reason it's not simple is because we're addicted to the material world in which we live. And I use the word addicted very deliberately. Addicted means addicted. We are dependent on it to the point we don't think we can live without it. Now, God wanted us to live in a material world. So that's part of the purpose. This isn't about an ascetic lifestyle or compromising our material lives. It's a question, however, of what we worship. You worship matter, you worship man-made things, you will be trapped by the fears that come with the material world. There's no two ways around it. So there's a battle for Ten Li HaNefesh. Who will control your soul? So ask yourself this question. Who's controlling it today and tomorrow? Who controls your soul? Not your body. Your body we know is controls. The material world controls your body. You need food, you need sustenance, you need shelter, you need an income. But what about your soul? Is your soul also being held hostage by those forces? So there's that story I often tell, which to me captures the whole idea so vividly, of the previous Chabad Rebbe, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak, when he was arrested in 1927. And he refused to cooperate with the authorities. Now we're talking about here, basically one step away from the Nazis were the Bolsheviks, especially regard to Jews, Stalin. They had no mercy at all. And he, for his own pride, because he did not want his soul to be compromised, refused to cooperate. So one of the Jewish captors, and they were worse than the non-Jewish ones, Jewish anti-Semites are always worse, pointed a gun to his head and said to him, Rebbe, it's time to start cooperating. He spoke in Yiddish to him. Because you see, this gun here has made many people cooperate. The threat of killing him. And the Rebbe calmly said to him, this toy, that's what he called it, this toy can frighten someone who has one world and many gods, but not someone who has one God and many worlds. And the end of the story, by the way, is that the guy who held the gun to him ended up being killed later, and this Rebbe ended up being freed and came to America, as a matter of fact. So, you never know who's in power, who's in control. It may look like controller right there. Yeah, material control, the one with the gun, of course, was more power. What the Rebbe was saying was the secret to all of life. Who is your God? If your material life, your refrigerator, is your God, so then you have only one God. That's your God. So then when death comes, it's over. Everything is over. That's one world and many gods. But as someone who this world is just one step of many journeys, not that he wanted to be killed, not that he did not embrace and celebrate life, but you're not going to frighten me with telling me that one stage of my existence is going to stop. Because I have something that's far more eternal. Now all this would be nice words if it was like just a pontificating session here. But as the Jewish people as a whole are actually living witnesses to this truth. You explain to me how they're here today. We're barely 14, 15 million people. What's the percentage of the population? It's less than 1, right? Less than 0.1. And yet, 40% of Nobel Prizes. I'm not saying this to pull rank. We did not have empires, nor money, nor nations. Till 50 years ago, we didn't even have a land. And even now with a land, what is it, the size of New Jersey, surrounded by 100 millions who don't want it there. So what is the secret of Jewish survival? No one has never been able to really figure it out. Because if you could, why not package it and sell the formula to everybody? Who wouldn't want such survival? The Dalai Lama, when people visit him, Jews visit him, I've heard this from several Jews, the first question he asked them always is, what was the secret of you lasting thousands of years without a country? Now he's obviously asking for personal reasons because he's out of his country, exiled, and he's concerned what will happen with his followers. So what is the secret? The secret is exactly what I just said. Jews never worshipped the material. So empires meant nothing. The Romans had one of the greatest empires of all time. The Greeks, the Persians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Spanish Empire, the Ottoman Empire. What's left of all of them? Memories, some literature. A nation that claims to be the direct descendants of the Romans? No. Even the great Aristotle, even the great thinkers who left great legacies, ideas, principles that shape modern life. Why didn't Aristotle feel it necessary to pass on to his children and grandchildren his teachings? That there would be an Aristotelian community, so to speak. It doesn't exist. He didn't even make it an aspiration. Abraham made it very clear, and he was a great philosopher, Abraham, that beyond my philosophy, the biggest commitment I make, to make sure that my children and my family, my home, the generations to come, will perpetuate the legacy of justice and charity that I have embraced. Which means he built his foundations not on his wealth, which he had plenty of, not on his material success, but on his faith, on the promise. And his grandchildren are sitting right here in this room now. And all over the world, small number, but what they have in quality is very hard to find elsewhere. Now, I'm not saying Jews don't have their problems. I'm not saying every individual Jew has it all worked out. But as a whole, we've made it here. And the reason nobody has ever been able to replicate the formula is because the price is a very high price. You cannot worship material world as much as you worship the spiritual world. When Mordechai paid the heavy price and everyone bowed to Haman, he refused to bow to him. It almost ended up causing the demise of the Jewish people. But he would not bow to something man-made. And in every generation there were those individuals. Today the sad fact is that most Jews have no clue why we made it till here and what we stand for. So strangely, prosperity and freedom is causing more problems and is more challenge to assimilation than all those enemies we've had. Because that's what happens. Comforts create complacency. So today the battle is against apathy, complacency, indifference. But the secret to bring it back to our personal lives, the secret it comes down to is knowing that right now inside of you, your heart is beating and your soul is beating. And that soul is a fearless force that does not take no for an answer, and nothing is impossible for it. The only question is how much of that soul is actively involved in your life. And usually it's a very small percentage. Children, young children, the soul is 99% control of their lives. Obviously a child cries for food, for tired, pain, and so on. That's survival. But the child's spirit, it's enthusiasm. Look at its enthusiasm. It's excitement about things. It's fearless. So yes, so we dismiss it by saying, okay, because the child's naive, it doesn't know, blah, blah. Tell it about the fears of life, the cruelties of life, and the child will become fearful. It's not true. The child will become fearful when we teach it to become fearful. I'm not suggesting growing up means maintaining that type of reckless, free abandon. It means being seasoned, wise, and understanding, but not letting the soul be extinguished or diminished as a result of the fears. As I've said many times, Jews have suffered greatly, but we have not become sufferers. Just because there are things to fear in this world doesn't mean you have to become a fearful person. It's one thing being prudent and having fear in a given situation, another is becoming a person of fear. Fear should be a verb in our lives, not a noun. A noun is a state of being. State of being, I am a fearful person. That's trouble. That's disaster, actually. To say I have fears at times, okay, there are things to have fear over. But the faith and the connection, that fear nothing but that which is beyond us, that which is eternal, is the secret. So the question is, how then do we connect to the soul? How can we bring the soul more into our lives than it is right now? Well, I think you don't need use your common sense. You know what you have to do? You have to give it time. Just like if your child says to you, I need mommy or tati or father, your papa or mama, whatever we call, abba, ima, father, mother. Your child says, I need attention. There's only one way to give a child attention, is to give the child attention. How does that sound for logic? Same thing with the soul. We need to give our soul more attention. We need to feed it. We nourish our bodies, you have to learn to nourish your soul. How do you nourish your soul? By being aware, number one, of it. By being a more sensitive person. And you wake up in the morning, before you jump into the material world, acknowledge that I have a soul inside of me. It's invisible, but it's the driving force. Ask your soul, what would you like to do today? What can we do that's fearless? How do we take on a challenge? And you'll be surprised that this soul has plenty to say. And there are actually books, there are Hebrew books and English books, Torah literature that talks to the soul, that describes the soul, that makes the soul feel comfortable. Now, what we have a minuscule taste of it is like when we listen to music. When you listen to music, sometimes you feel you can do anything, because music suddenly awakens that youthfulness, reminds us, but doesn't last long. Because music is more of almost like a drug. I don't mean it in a bad way, but it's a drug, meaning it hasn't been internalized, integrated. It just sparks something. The question is, how do you hold on to that? That requires soulfulness. And there's soulful way of living, and there's bodyful way of living. It's not the same thing. Every given situation, tell me anefesh, who's going to control your soul? You have one voice that says, take, another voice that says, give. You meet somebody. You have those two choices. To give or to take. To be self-oriented or self-centric, egocentric, or God-centric. Abraham, when someone came his way, a stranger, first thing he thought, how could I help this person? He didn't think, how could that person help me? Now, I'm not suggesting, again, that we shouldn't have opportunities. If we're in working and business, obviously there's situations where we'd like to get people's support. We want clients, we want customers. But that's a part of your life. That's what you got to do for survival. It's not the primary driving force in your life has to be is, what am I giving? How much have I given today? It's a completely different mindset, but that's how the soul thinks, you see, because the soul is secure. It doesn't need to take to be more, to be greater. The body doesn't get something, it feels inadequate. The soul doesn't give, it feels inadequate. Completely different rules of the game. But what you get in return is great confidence. That Rebbe wasn't playing a game, he wasn't being cute when he said, he had a gun to his head with a bullet in it. He was sincere. He was not frightened. He was not frightened by man-made things. Not that he wanted to die. He ended up not dying. Not whether we have such presence of mind for all of us, probably not. But there's a opening statement in the Shulchan Aruch, the code of Jewish law, that says, Al yevish mepnei amaligim. Do not be embarrassed by those that will mock you, that will laugh at you. Essentially saying that the first opening statement is, do not be afraid of standing out. Do not be afraid of being different. We're not talking about being different just to be different. We're not be afraid to be who you are. And everyone talks about Steve Jobs' commencement address to Stanford. That's basically what he said. He didn't read it in the Parsha Lech Lecha, but he got it somewhere else. But this is essentially the story of Abraham. Once he discovered what he discovered, he didn't really care whether his parents liked it or didn't, or whether society liked it. He did what he did. And look what we have today as a result of him. And he had to face plenty of challenges besides being mocked. So there's an ongoing battle going on right now over your soul. Who will control it? Think of it like a hammer and a hand. Does the hammers of your life, do the tools of your life tell your hands where to go? Or do your hands tell the hammer where to go? Now it would be a little odd, right? If your glove told your hand where to go, or your tool told your hand where to go. But that's essentially how we live our lives. Our bodies take our souls for a ride. Whatever our whim, whatever desire. It should be the other way around. The captain of the ship should be your soul. The soul is the driving force, and the body is a tool to implement. The vision of your life comes from the soul. The body has no vision. The body is a survival force. The body is like fuel. It feeds, it eats, it breeds, protects you. It's the wall around your soul, the body. But the soul is a force that is, in most cases, starving within us, because it gets so little nourishment as we get older, because most of the time we're busy nourishing our body and our material part of our lives. So there's a battle of ten liya nefesh. Who will give me the soul? The body wants the soul, and your soul wants its own freedom. And the key to all courage and the antidote to fear is how much of that soul will speak to you in your daily life. It's as simple as that. And the challenge that we have is, how do we begin tonight and tomorrow? Well, my friends, there's only one way, is to do things differently. You don't do things differently, you're not going to have different results. How do you do things differently? You try new things, and not necessarily frightening things or threatening or some type of cold turkey change of your whole life. You start tonight, instead of falling asleep with the television on, with a newspaper in your nose, read a spiritual poem, hear a nice song. Go to sleep, not with the thoughts that burdened you all day. That's not where you should be. You should find something that breaks from that day, from the material anxieties of your life, and find something that speaks to your soul. It could be anything. And let that be what enters the resting hours of your sleep. And when you wake up in the morning, instead of immediately thinking, what obligations I have today, what job obligations, other obligations, say a short prayer. I've always suggested the prayer, Moda'ani. I acknowledge to you for returning my soul to me. Say it any words you like, meditate any way you wish. But say it sincerely, not just lip service. Focus on what just happened. I just slept and now I'm aware. Pop my eyes open. Of course, most of us hear the alarm clock first. Today alarm clocks have all kinds of new interesting sounds based on the new smartphones. But forget about the alarm clock. What just happened? Several hours. You were asleep, not really aware. Think about the life force inside of you. What does it mean? Why were you given a new day? What can you do today to make your little corner of the world a bit more refined? The difficulty in everything I'm saying here is not in doing it, it's the routines that we have that we don't do it. And because we don't do it, it's difficult to start a new thing. It's like starting to brush your teeth after you haven't done it for 30 years. I don't mean to use that example, but it's an example. So of course, if we did this with our children every day and it became a pattern, that would be a great gift. But at this point, this is what we should do. You'll say, well, how is that going to solve my problems? I have a difficulty finding my soulmate. You tell me I should say Modani in the morning? It doesn't seem commensurate with my big, huge problems. But every huge problem began somewhere small, and every huge problem is resolved with something small. Nothing happens. There's no panacea. There's no magic trick. It's just like anything. You get tangled, your life gets tangled up. You can't just untangle it in one shot. Start untangling the edges, the beginnings, the places you could reach, and clarity breeds clarity. So someone say, well, I'm completely confused about the most important things in my life. So start in the areas that you could find that are a little easier, less resistance. Find some clarity there. As I said, clarity breeds clarity. And confusion breeds confusion. And it's also one of the traps. Because when we're overwhelmed by our problem dominates and dictates. And unless we find a solution to the direct problem, we ignore everything else. And it's not correct. It starts with, if you've been breathing toxins for a long, extended period of time, the first step is to start breathing healthy air. You say, what about all those toxins? Start a little breathing every day, a little healthy air, and you know what's going to happen? Slowly it'll start filling your lungs. Slowly replace where those toxins are, and then we'll begin to have a fighting chance. Now, obviously, there are situations where you need to have additional strength. God forbid you bring a person who's been in an accident or something has happened to them that's very traumatic. So the first thing you have to do is stop the bleeding. Short-term solutions. But then you have to find the longer-term ones, the ones that last, that are sustainable. So there's no such thing as anything too small. The smallest things can make the biggest difference. As a matter of fact, it's much more trustworthy to do something in small day to day than find some cramming session where you can say, oh, this is it, all my problems are solved. Last week, Barry told me an expression. I'm trying to ask you to tell me those few words you said to me. What were those words? Can you remind me? A few English words that were a combination of interesting, not euphoria, harmony. Was it harmony?
Beauty.
What's beauty?
Beauty was the act of responding to your own call.
Beauty, the original root of the word beauty, is the act of responding to your own calling. Interesting. That's beauty. What do most of us think beauty is? Some fashion magazine. Botox. Some external. The response, the act of responding to your own calling. Thoreau put it this way. Is the sound working, by the way, because this is on red? Do you see it going up and down? Yeah? So, he says like this. Most men lead lives of quiet desperation. But then the second half. And die with their song still inside them. Abraham taught us that you don't have to die with your song still inside you. You don't have to die at all, for that matter, and you can access that song. That's real beauty, inner beauty. No problem with outer beauty, but they should be aligned. If outer beauty replaces inner beauty, it's trouble. Because then you're worshiping things that no way can last. There's no way outer beauty can last. Preserve inner beauty, and you'll have outer beauty too. Because it all depends on different stages. What was that, the other word, Barry? Just besides beauty. Just getting it for the record. There was good expressions. Well, if it comes to you, you'll tell me. Yeah, some of these interesting words, when you trace them to their root, they teach you a lot of interesting things.
One a little bit different was the word disaster, which means lose an asking star. It means to lose your guiding star.
Disaster means to lose your guiding star. Yeah, that's a good one.
You find your star, the Orient, when you're in total darkness.
Right. And you can only find your star when you're in total darkness. That's interesting. Well, I want to wish everybody that they should find their star even if they're not in total darkness. Even though most of us are in total darkness, so that's moot. But the point is, yes, a disaster. So different beauty is finding your own star, and disaster is not finding your star. Okay. And it's interesting to talk about stars. This verse, the Torah also says that God says to Abraham at the end of this chapter, he says, look up to heaven. Just looking for the exact expression. Yeah. This is 15 verse 5. So after God tells him, do not be afraid, I will be your shield. So it's a divine shield. He says, he took him outside. God led Abraham outside of his tent and said, please look heavenward and count the stars, if you're able to count them. And then he answers, then God says to him, this is how numerous your descendants will be. Now the words actually doesn't say numerous, it says, this is how your children will be. So Rashi, the commentary, says numerous. But the stars also reflect this is how they will be, which means that they will always shine. As you just said, even in darkness, they will shine. And they will be as numerous as the stars. Now, of course, it doesn't mean as numerous, because as I said before, we're only 14 million strong. But we're everywhere. As many anti-Semites like to remind the world. And we have influence. And we are fighters. And we're examples of survival. And the promise was fulfilled. Thousands of years ago, Abraham was told this. And this is all in reward. Not reward, a magical reward, a direct result because Abraham paid the ultimate price. He chose eternity over temporary pleasure, over instant gratification. It's a difficult challenge. I mean, we all have those moments, right? Who of us has not been seduced by instant gratification? It's very, very powerful. But look at the results of a person who forewent. Can you say forewent? That he foregoed, whatever the word is. You get the idea. And he allowed himself to embrace that which was eternal. This is why Abraham is unique. Because it doesn't come every day. And he paved a way that he had no one to look at. He did this all by himself. Even his parents, who we know Terach is his father, we only know Terach exists because of Abraham. So I want to conclude by wishing everyone that we should all live up to be the shining stars that Abraham saw in that heaven that night. And that if Abraham was here today, we'd be proud of us. That we in our own small or big way forge our own paths. And don't let the song die inside of us. And the key to it is to recognize your soul within you, embrace it, feed it. You have to nourish it. Find a class once a week, or once a day if possible, that feeds your soul. You wake up in the morning, go to sleep at night, find ways to feed that soul. Throughout the day, through acts of kindness, random acts of kindness, meaning even if it's unconditional, not necessarily you're going to gain something directly from it. The more soulfulness, the more sensitivity, the more refined behavior you do day after day, the more your soul is fed, and the stronger your soul becomes, the more fearless you become. Try it out and tell me if it works. You're not going to find fearlessness except that way. There's no other trick. That is guaranteed. Because you then become more confident in your soul, and it becomes confident in you, and you realize, I have all the power in the world. I have the power to be as kind as I want to be. If you're going to be dependent on others, and it's going. So, to sum up, we're not dependent on anyone for our souls. If we're dependent on anything, it's purely for bodily things. But your soul is dependent on your attitude, your approach, your disposition. So God should bless us all to be those stars, those shining stars, that Abraham be proud of us. As I said, we blaze and trailblaze and forge new paths and new openings. As I said, try it out. Feed your soul in the morning, in the evening, during the day. More. So thank you very much.